We're now going to look at the equilibrium that can take place when you combine your aggregate demand curve and your aggregate supply curve. So once again, if we had it in terms of price and output, you have your downward sloping aggregate demand curve, your upward sloping aggregate supply curve, and you get to an equilibrium where they intersect. Let's have a look at the movements of the economy if they weren't in equilibrium. So what happens if the price is at that level? P0. If the price is at that level, aggregate supply would be at very low, aggregate demand would be very high. So these values would not coincide. There would be a lot more demand for a lot fewer goods. What happens when there is a lot of demand for fewer goods? Well, when a lot of people demand few goods, such as a lot of people demanding movie tickets for a concert, it's going to force the price upwards. So the price is going to be forced upwards as these consumers struggle to get hold of a few goods. So it forces the price upwards, and as the price is forced upwards, suppliers have a greater incentive to produce more, so it increases aggregate supply, and it also decreases demand as the price increases, aggregate demand, up until that point in equilibrium. At that equilibrium point, there will be no change. It's Y star and P star. So that gives you your level of equilibrium. What happens if the government expenditure increased? That would shift the AD curve to the right. So if the AD curve shifts to the right, you would increase the price and you would increase output. YG for government expenditure and PG. So the government expenditure increases, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, which increases equilibrium output and increases equilibrium price. This is a result of demand pull inflation. As the government expenditure gets into the market, creates a whole lot more demand, and it pushes up prices. It's demand pull inflation. Notice that the smaller the increase in price, the greater the effect on your output. If I were to draw a graph such as this, the slope of your aggregate supply curve has a very large effect on how much output you're going to have. So let's say your aggregate supply curve is very flat. If it is very flat and you increase aggregate demand, if there is a very small increase in the price level, you're going to get a very large increase in output. However, if the aggregate supply curve was very steep, you would have to have a very large increase in price, and you would still have an even smaller increase in output. So the effect on output is dependent, let me just label these, aggregate supply 1. So the effect on output is dependent on how far the price increases. If there is a large price increase, you're going to have a very small effect on output. If there is a small price increase, you're going to have a very large effect on output. Now, if aggregate demand were to decrease, you would decrease the amount of output in the economy. So it would lead to a recession and perhaps cyclical unemployment. So if you had price and output and you've got aggregate demand, but then aggregate demand decreases to this point, what do you think is going to happen to price? Well, price should decrease, but in reality, price doesn't decrease that much. It's very sticky downwards, which is what I mentioned earlier. So you wouldn't actually decrease your output to a value such as that, Y0, Y1. You'd actually decrease your output by a far larger margin to say Y2 because of the fear of decreasing the price, because of the price stickiness downwards. I mentioned that there were wage contracts which made price sticky downwards. Since your wage was set for 2 years and the price decreased, you had to get paid that amount. Also menu costs, it costs a lot of money to decrease the price, so firms aren't willing to decrease the price. Another factor is they don't want to decrease morale and they don't want to decrease productivity. If you were working and suddenly you're getting paid a lot less to do the same job, your morale is going to decrease and your productivity is going to decrease, and that's going to have a worse effect on the firm. There are also fears of price wars. If you were to decrease your price, other people will try and follow you and undercut you to gain market share, and you might start a price war, which is very bad for your business. So prices are very sticky downwards. They don't get there. Instead, it shifts the output even further back than it would normally, and so you'd have a recession and perhaps even cyclical unemployment. Finally, imagine there was a decrease in aggregate supply. So this is what would say happen in South Africa with increases in red tape for medium-sized businesses. It would increase per unit production cost and shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Aggregate supply 0, aggregate supply 1, 81, 80. So it would shift your aggregate supply curve to the left. You would decrease output. Prices would increase because they're not sticky downwards. So it would result in a decrease in output as well as inflation. And this is now cost push inflation. Where aggregate demand shifted outwards, you had demand pull inflation, but now you have cost push inflation because the per unit production costs of the businesses has increased and those production costs have now been passed on through to consumers. So what you need to know for this section is the analysis between aggregate demand, which looks at all the individuals and how total demand and total output is demanded on aggregate through the economy, and how aggregate supply is affected by price throughout the economy. And you need to know the effects of changes in AD and AS, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, what changes aggregate demand, what changes aggregate supply, how they interact, and how price and changes in price can affect output.